Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Living New Deal webinar. My name is Bridget, and I am your technical support for today. I just wanted to point out a few things before we get started. For the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A section, and at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A function, and we ask that you put any questions in the Q&A as opposed to putting them in the chat. You can use the chat if you need technical support or to make comments, but any questions that you would like the panelists to address, please use the Q&A function. The webinar will last roughly 1 hour, and we are actually live on Facebook on the Living New Deal Facebook page. So if you know anybody who might be interested in seeing what this webinar is all about, you can go ahead and find it on the Facebook page and share that link with your community. And thank you so much. And now I'm going to bring on Susan for the introduction.
Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Why the New Deal Matters. I'm Susan Ives, Director of Communications for the Living New Deal, a nonprofit organization in Berkeley, California that's popularizing the idea of a new New Deal. Our Living New Deal was founded at UC Berkeley about a dozen years ago. Our team now stretches from the West Coast to the East Coast, with dozens of volunteer advisors, researchers, and associates in between. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy, make people aware of what the New Deal was and did, and promote the New Deal as a model for governing today. The Living New Deal maintains a growing website documenting what the New Deal built across the country, from post offices to parks, from schools to sidewalks to city halls. Through our publications and programs like this, we're educating the public about the New Deal's pivotal role during a national crisis. This webinar series, titled The Next New Deal, draws parallels with the New Deal then and what a New Deal might look like today. We have another webinar coming up in a few weeks. On October 21st, Neil Maher, author of Nature's New Deal, will be speaking about the original Civilian Conservation Corps and the lessons it offers for the 21st century Civilian Climate Corps, as proposed by the Biden administration. No matter where we look in America, we're surrounded by the legacy of the New Deal initiatives. And tonight's guests, Eric Rauchway and Elizabeth Cohn, will delve into why the New Deal remains so relevant and instructive today. Eric Rauchway is Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. He's written 7 books on US history from the Great Depression through the Second World War. His most recent book, Why the New Deal Matters, was published by Yale University Press this year, to much acclaim, I might add. Eric serves on the Living New Deal Research Board and has been instrumental in the Living New Deal's New Deal Book Award and serves on its review committee. We're inviting nominations for the New Deal Book Award through November 15th. Nonfiction books about the New Deal published in 2021 are eligible. Check out thelivingNewDeal.org for details. Leading the conversation tonight is Elizabeth Cohn. She is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies in the Department of History at Harvard University. Her books include Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, and Saving America's Cities, which won the Bancroft Prize for 2020. Her recent article, How to Build a Nation, published in The Atlantic, takes lessons from the Great Depression and applies them to the COVID crisis. She is a member of the Living New Deal Advisory Board. Thank you, Eric and Elizabeth, for being here tonight. And thank you, our audience, for your presence. Your donations make our work documenting the New Deal and programs like this available to everyone, and we welcome your support. And now on to a very timely conversation on why the New Deal matters with Eric Rauchway and Elizabeth Cohn. Thank you. Elizabeth, you need to unmute.
Yep, I got it. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And it's an honor to talk with Eric Rauschway, an historian I admire very much, about his new book, and also about more broadly about the New Deal as history, as well as relevant to many of the challenges that we face today in the United States. I also just want to add my 2 cents to the endorsement of the Living New Deal organization, and basically say how grateful I am for its commitment to keeping the New Deal as part of our usable past. So Eric and I are going to talk for about 35 minutes. And then for those of you who may just have joined, you'll have a chance to join into the conversation. And we'll have about 15 minutes left, I hope, for Q&A. And you can submit your questions through the Q&A function. So let's dig in. I'd like to start, Eric, with a couple very general questions to just set the stage here before we get into the nitty-gritty of the New Deal yesterday and today. You've written a fair amount already about the New Deal, and so I wondered why you wrote this book at this moment in time.
Well, I think it's a good time to talk about why the New Deal matters, as you've already said, or as Susan very kindly said about your own work. A lot of us have been thinking about the New Deal lately, and I think it's vital to point out that the world that we live in is shaped by the New Deal, whether we live in the United States or not. But certainly, if we live in the United States, the New Deal is pretty much everywhere, and it's under threat, both from causes that we've brought upon ourselves as well as natural causes. And we depend upon it, and we don't even realize how much we depend upon it. It's like the proverbial fish that doesn't know it's wet because it spent all its time in the water. I think we don't realize how much we use the New Deal all the time, how much it affects us, how much it governs economic activity, land use, urban planning, and pretty much everything that we do in the United States from soup to nuts. So that's the first thing. The New Deal is everywhere. We depend on it, and it's a little bit under threat even as we speak. And the second thing, and the thing that strikes me as being the most important to emphasize when talking about the New Deal in the past, and maybe how we think about it as a possible inspiration for our time, is that for the New Dealers in 1933 and through the 1930s, the New Deal was not only, and maybe not even most importantly, about recovery from the Depression, but it was about preserving American democracy, flawed as it was, at a time when it was under threat. And that's something I think that we might want to think about, the role of the New Deal in promoting and showing the vitality of democratic institutions.
Okay, thank you. It's been almost a century since the New Deal was launched, and yet we still invoke it frequently, or at least we say we're learning from it. But there have been many other significant, even transformative policy regimes since then. For liberals, one could point to the Great Society. For conservatives, you could talk to Reaganism. You can talk about Reaganism and how much that sort of reshaped a lot of our assumptions about government and society. So why do you think the New Deal continues to resonate as a kind of touchstone, and really for a significant portion of the American population?
Well, I think it's because it touches us all. As I say, you can't even carry on ordinary economic activity without dealing with the New Deal. If you have a bank account, if you've earned the minimum wage, if you've taken out a mortgage, if you've joined a union, if you draw an old age pension or disability, all of these things are either directly part of the New Deal or legacies of the New Deal. And even if you just handled a unit of the United States currency, that's something that the Franklin Roosevelt administration created in the very first months, the dollar that we have today, of Roosevelt's time in office. So almost all economic activity that we undertake depends on New Deal institutions. And as I say, there's something about it that still inspires us. It is certainly the largest, if not the only, really sort of peacetime expression of national unity, of the idea that Roosevelt called interdependence, that we cannot, any of us, prosper unless all of us prosper, that we depend on each other for our welfare. And that's still an idea that moves many people in America and around the world.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on that a bit more. It's no secret today that we're a polarized country, politically, socially, culturally. And FDR did manage, as you just referenced, to speak to some common purpose, to inspire a sense of common purpose. And it sure seems difficult to do that today. His message resonated in that he was reelected with big margins in 32 and particularly in 1936. So, think about, why is it so difficult to convey that message today to the point where we couldn't even fight an epidemic as a unified country? Is there some way that we might learn from how FDR made that appeal? And I would add here that, it's not like, he didn't have enemies, and opponents. There were people on the right and the left, thinking here of Huey Long, of Father Coughlin. Early in his administration, the Communist Party, there were American fascists. How did he manage those opponents so that their challenges weren't crippling to his agenda? And how did he somehow inspire this sense of common purpose? And can you suggest any pointers for our current president?
Well, let's tackle the first question first, which is safely in the past and something that therefore I think we can reckon with. I mean, you point out correctly that Roosevelt was reelected in 1936 with an overwhelming majority, not only in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote, getting some 60% of the vote. This is knocking it out of the park, electorally speaking. This is the biggest majority that anyone had since James Monroe ran unopposed, as historians like to point out. That doesn't mean, though, as we've just said, that it's universal, right? 60% is not everyone. He had people who didn't like him. What Roosevelt's core insight, I think, was, and I think you're correct, of course he had enemies and opponents. His core insight was that good policy is good politics, right? That if you get through legislation that people like, if you make sure, as I say, that you appeal to that idea of interdependence, that people can see, in this case, that the New Deal is working not only for other people who are the needy or whatever, but for them and their neighbors, right? The WPA liked to point out, the PWA liked to point out that they had public works projects in every county in the country, right? You couldn't go anywhere and not see the New Deal at work in the 1930s, just as is true today. That's why its legacy is so lasting. So people could see that the New Deal worked for them. The recovery was very strong in Roosevelt's first term in office. The economic recovery was very strong in Roosevelt's first term in office. They had growth rates of the economy in the neighborhood of 8, 9, and 10%. Right? People could see that. It wasn't perfect, right, by 1936, but people could see that things were moving in the right direction. And as Roosevelt understood, that gave him the leeway to say of his opponents, as he did in 1934, for example, some people's toes are going to get stepped on, right? He was not shy of pointing out, with his very popular agenda, that those who didn't like it were in the minority. And I think that's key. It's the flip side, if you like, of Roosevelt's tremendous popularity, is that he wielded it as a tool against his opponents. So if he had a policy that would have been polling at 60 or 70%, he wasn't shy of telling the 30 or 40%,
You still there, Eric?
I'm still here. Yeah, there seem to have been a number of complaints about technical difficulties. So I don't know what's going on.
Can I just bust in for just a second here? This is
Sure.
Bridget. Elizabeth, can you bring your volume on your microphone down just a tad?
Okay.
There's people who are experiencing distortion. I'm not experiencing it on my end, but
How is that? Is that better?
let's see, Alana, is that better? You can just say check, check, check. Yes, better. Great. Move on. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Okay. So we had, yes, common purpose and, in his success in, well, I mean, having that, what you're suggesting, of course, is that that strong base of support gave him a lot of confidence. But also, I think the point you made that they were very deliberate in making sure that the benefits of the New Deal reached nationally, so that it was felt in many places. Anything else you would want to add to that? Because Biden is obviously suffering for not really quite able to be successful in this common purpose business.
Well, right. I mean, I think that we want to look at the things that are at least not the problems, from the standpoint of history. I mean, sometimes people forget that Roosevelt faced a hostile press landscape. They wouldn't have called it a media landscape then, but a press landscape in much the same way that Democratic politicians do today. The vast majority of the most popular newspaper dailies, which was how most people got their news, were opposed to the New Deal, and particularly to Roosevelt's anti-Nazi foreign policy, as that became more important as the 1930s went on. So he knew that he had to sort of go around, the press, that he couldn't make his case through the press. So that was one thing that's true. People sometimes point to, of course, and this is obviously relevant today, if folks have been looking at the headlines today, there's that one vote that the Democrats have in the Senate. That's obviously critical. And Roosevelt had huge margins in both houses of Congress. To a degree, though, those margins were illusory, right? The Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate depended heavily on the contingent from southern states, which was the Jim Crow South, which was extremely hostile to many parts of the New Deal, not only those that dealt directly with civil rights issues. For example, they repeatedly stymied the efforts to pass a federal anti-lynching bill, but also to bits of the New Deal that threatened to raise wages and thus to disrupt the kind of class and race hierarchy that prevailed in the Jim Crow South. So there was a substantial portion of his own party that was hostile to Roosevelt's and the New Dealers' agenda.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up a little bit on that issue, because it's not just that he had, business leaders who were opposed to him and, populists who were opposed to him, but he really did have divisions within his own party that are not unlike what we're seeing today, where the progressives and the moderates within the Democratic Party are really fighting it out. And I would point, as you have, to the pressure that he was under from Southern Democrats, and that did lead to real limitations in what he could do against racial discrimination, the anti-lynching legislation you mentioned. It also excluded the occupations of agriculture and domestic work from fair labor standards, from Social Security, and so forth. So, what can we learn from the way FDR managed those divisions within his own party for the struggles that, the Democratic Party is having today? And do you think that in some ways he made it too much of a deal with the devil? Was he too quick to compromise? He did make draw attention to his consultations with his Black cabinet. But, overall, it was not a racially progressive platform or agenda. So was that just a necessity? Might he have played that differently? And do you see ways in which he got what he wanted despite opposition from those Southern Democrats that might be useful today?
Yeah, well, one of the things I wanted to delve into in the book is the relationship between the New Deal and a number of racial minorities, specifically Black Americans, and also in another chapter, Native Americans, which I think are critical to how we think about invoking the New Deal today. I don't know if you've seen this, but every now and then, Jim Clyburn will pop up and say, the New Deal is not what we should be invoking because the New Deal was hostile to Black voters. I mean, that's true to a degree for the reasons that you've just said, right? That there were New Deal programs, particularly those in the South, the Tennessee Valley Authority is the obvious one, right? Which were segregationist, which were discriminatory towards Black citizens of the areas where they operated. We shouldn't lose sight, though, and this makes this period of history different from ours, that it was owing to the New Deal that Black voters became Democrats. Right? Black voters, almost in a body, switched from being Republicans to Democrats because of the New Deal. As discriminatory as we should acknowledge it was, as discriminatory as they knew it to be at the time, right? It was nevertheless a lot better than what Herbert Hoover and his predecessors had been offering them. And not only that, the Democratic Party was responsive to this new Black electorate, right? By the end of Roosevelt's second term, the Department of Justice had instituted a new civil rights enforcement section, right, which would become the Civil Rights Unit, because they knew that this was a core part of the New Deal agenda, as it would have to be going forward. So there's a push and pull between the Democratic Party as it was with this sort of legacy of post-Civil War Democrats that, were opposed to anything resembling civil rights, and the Democratic Party as it was becoming because of the New Deal, which is one that would include and be responsive to Black voters. So it's much more complicated than the Clyburn version or than the wonderful small d Democratic version you might have. It's a very kind of interesting episode in the nation's history, and the one that I think is worth delving into. I mean, you ask, should Roosevelt have been more forward on civil rights? I mean, I kind of feel ill-equipped myself to answer that question for a variety of reasons, not least that, he won re-election repeatedly, so it's hard to argue with success. It's also because his own Black advisors, even though they were not particularly pleased with him often on the subject of civil rights, were nevertheless admiring of what he achieved, right? And I can think of no better way to put this than to borrow from Robert Weaver, who worked for the Public Works Administration during the New Deal and who later became the first Black cabinet secretary in United States history under Lyndon Johnson, who, when he was asked about this later, said, Franklin Roosevelt was not a great civil rights president. He was, however, a great president, right? And Weaver's view was Roosevelt prioritized first the New Deal, which he couldn't have got through without working with the Southern Caucus, and then preparedness for the war, which even more so he couldn't have got through without, support from the Southern Caucus. And that in Weaver's view, as in many other people's view, these were obviously high priorities.
I have to add that he did also have Eleanor, who was much more out there on race issues. So, he had a left flank there that helped as well. While we're sort of talking about this political terrain, one of the things I found interesting in the book was the reminder of how several of the very important members of FDR's cabinet had actually been former Republicans. And here, what I'm referring to, Francis Perkins, Henry Wallace, Harold Ickes, and that's, kind of a surprising reminder. And I'm wondering whether you see their presence in the New Deal as reflective of just the changes that the parties went through, in that there were progressives were Republicans at one moment in time, and many of these people came out of that tradition? Or was this, in fact, FDR reaching across the aisle, as we would say nowadays?
I think it's very definitely a part of the story of the parties realigning, right? That we've already sort of alluded to in talking about the African-American vote switching from Republicans to Democrats. And the same is true largely, not exclusively and not instantly, but still of people who identified themselves as progressives, switching from the Republicans to the Democrats. As you know, there was another Roosevelt, right? The fifth cousin to Franklin Roosevelt, his Eleanor's uncle, so Roosevelt's uncle by marriage, Theodore, who had been known as a progressive, who had run on a ticket called the progressive ticket, who had been identified on what we would today call economically progressive causes, pro-labor causes, aid to mothers with dependent children, that sort of thing. And so there were a lot of Republicans who thought of themselves as Theodore Roosevelt Republicans, who had figured out through the presidencies of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover that they no longer had a home in the Republican Party and were looking for some place to go. There's an interesting correspondence between Ickes and Wallace, both of whom you mentioned, during the period between Roosevelt's election and his inauguration, where Ickes says, we're going to give this Roosevelt a chance, and if this doesn't work, we're going to have to, create a third party, a whole different party, because we tried once before to see if there could be Democrats as progressives during the Wilson administration. That didn't really play. So we're going to give it one more chance, and then we're going to have to try a third thing. But not only is Roosevelt bringing these Republican progressives into his administration, in many respects they're the most progressive members.
Yeah, that's what's so striking. Yeah,
Perkins and Wallace and Ickes are really, by anybody's measure, far to the left of the New Deal cabinet. So you're looking at a realignment of the parties where a lot of the conservative Democrats are becoming alienated from the mainstream of the party, from the National Party, and progressive Republicans are leaving their party and joining the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Another topic I'd like to take on is that one of the most important achievements of the New Deal that is often invoked, certainly by progressives in our use of it today, is how it strengthened the authority of the federal government. I mean, one could even argue that the American sort of federalist system, which reserves a lot of powers to the states, was actually restructured in the New Deal, with the national government gaining much more influence, setting standards that would then be national and so forth. But we did see in the Trump administration, in its handling of the COVID epidemic, for example, and in many of the struggles that we're watching happening, in real time right now over the vaccine and mask mandates, over the voting rules, that states are really reasserting themselves in powerful ways. And so I just wondered if you'd reflect on what you think is going on here. Why has this restructuring that we assumed accompanied the New Deal not persisting? Why has it, in fact, if the New Deal was so formative and fundamentally transformative, why is this system, this federalist system, so vulnerable to further influences? And I wonder whether what you think about the strategies that the FDR and his New Dealers used to strengthen the hand of Washington at the time, whether there's anything we can learn from how they really did transform, the political landscape that might be useful today as we try to kind of strengthen the hand of the federal government again.
Yeah, well, to the extent that you're asking me, why did the New Deal go away and why or lose strength over the last few decades? I mean, it hasn't been a sudden thing, right? In many respects, it goes back to Roosevelt's first campaign for election in 1932, where Herbert Hoover explained that the proposed New Deal was a step towards Moscow, right? He said, I can smell on it the same fumes that boiled over in Moscow and in their attenuated flavor spread over the rest of Europe, right? That's a close paraphrase. In other words, that it was socialist, that it was communist, that it was un-American. That critique remains the same down to today, when Senator Rubio of Florida said the exact same thing about President Biden's proposed agenda for infrastructure construction, right? That's the critique. It has been, all the way back since 1932, that the New Deal and its heirs are un-American because they are socialist, communist, Marxist, whatever. Constantly hammering away at that, getting the support of business interests to, have well-funded campaigns to put that point across, as many historians have pointed out, including most recently Larry Glickman at Cornell, right? Have demonstrated that there's a tremendous investment in trying to show, to argue, to persuade Americans that their history is not the history that leads to the New Deal, that that's some kind of alien engraftment onto American culture. And this battle over the history wars that we continue to have always reflects that. So that's one thing. It gains steam in the early 70s because the effects of the Vietnam War, both politically and economically, have rendered the Johnson administration and the Great Society, which, as you correctly point out, is a legatee of the New Deal, right? You know, Lyndon Johnson always wanted to outdo Franklin Roosevelt. That was essentially his whole point of being a president, right? You know, rendered it kind of suspect to a lot of voters. And Americans, even Democrats, have been kind of running away from the New Deal from the 1970s down to about this year. Right? I mean, I don't know if you remember this last year when there was the nominating contest for the Democratic Party. One of the leading contenders, Pete Buttigieg, made a point of saying that he didn't want to return to the excesses of the New Deal. Right? I mean, you know, we don't all think of them as excesses, but many people did. Now, it's all of a sudden this year that we are suddenly seeing national Democrats invoking the New Deal, not just left-identified Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's been doing it for a while, but, you know, Joe Biden, who's been in elective politics for as long as I've been alive and is all of a sudden invoking the New Deal, right, as the way of thinking about the country. Now, the reason for that, again, you point out correctly in your question, is the crisis that we face. There's nothing that better demonstrates the poverty of a local approach than a pandemic, right? Viruses are no respecters of political boundaries or budgets or any of those things. So when we saw during the Trump administration that the federal government was going to leave the combating of the pandemic to localities, we saw how massively and practically ineffective that was. And in the early months, early weeks even, of the Biden administration, we saw how changing your mind about that could immediately produce results, right? I mean, they were able to get and to distribute vaccine rapidly by using the Federal Emergency Management Administration, by using the National Guard, by using all of the resources of the federal government, even to get it into the further flung parts of the country, right? So they demonstrated right away what the federal government can do when it wants to, right? And for many people, that was an enlightening demonstration. Now, obviously, it can't make people take the vaccine if they don't want to, or at least it is unwilling so far to exercise its power to do that. But that's a different question. But that does lead into I guess the other part of what you asked, which is what can we learn from those early New Dealers? I mean, in 1933, when Roosevelt came into office, the New Deal obviously hadn't been passed as an agenda by Congress, and yet the federal government was able to provide immediate relief in many ways by using existing federal capacity. And this is something, again, we've just seen with Biden and the use of FEMA and stuff like that. But, you know, the Roosevelt administration used legislation and monies that were left over from the First World War, for example, to counteract the immediate banking crisis. They used the Army and the Veterans Administration to distribute money and materiel for relief work in the fall of 1933, right? So they made use of what the federal government already was, and then, of course, they built on that using the political capital they generated by their early successes. I mean, the obvious point would be to say that the Biden administration should be so bold and creative and should build on its early successes by moving further forward and making use. I mean, the federal government now is much more powerful than it was in 1933. So certainly the opportunities are there.
Yeah, I mean, but it's important to see this as a process, and I think you're presenting it that way and to remind ourselves that, FDR came in and inherited a legacy of Hoover, of anti-statism, of pro-business. Hoover had failed. That helped. But still, I mean, it was a big selling job, and I think that we might really learn from how they managed to ease people. And one of the things that I think you could say is that they were very aware of this resistance, obviously, to strong federal government, and they made sure to channel a lot of their programs and resources through the states so that people weren't necessarily identifying these resources with the federal government. They were also getting them through traditional agencies that were state and county and local and so forth. So they were very skilled, I think, in how they sort of manage this transition.
Yes, and it's also vitally important that when those localized programs didn't succeed, as was the case with the early Federal Emergency Relief Administration, they then federalized it. They said, well, that didn't work. We are now going to have Harry Hopkins personally employing people because, we cannot abide the continuation of the crisis. We gave the federal structure a shot. It was not successful. We are now moving on to a national approach.
You make a great deal in the book of the major contribution of the New Deal to the building and upgrading of the nation's infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, public buildings, in other words, public works. And in fact, we're still living with and patching up the infrastructure that was constructed in that period of time. This is obviously a major part of President Biden's agenda, but getting it through is proving quite difficult. And did you discover any of that kind of resistance at the time that might be useful as we think about how to promote this today? You'd think it would be a no-brainer, and everybody thought it would be because there's such a tremendous need, and who doesn't want to distribute jobs and money, and yet there is resistance. And was there at the time, or was this an easy sell?
There was at the time, as Harry Hopkins, who has played a number of roles for the Roosevelt administration, says, there's some people in this country would shoot Santa Claus, right? That there is just simply, people don't know what's good for them, was his argument. And I think you can see something similar to that today. And again, the key thing that I can point to is that, and as you alluded to just a minute ago, is the New Deal built on its successes. So, rescuing the banks in the first week or so bought them some time, rolling out an initial agenda of public works, even before people had those jobs, bought them some time and goodwill. Actually then delivering on those jobs in the fall of 1933 with the Civil Works Administration was critical because it showed people they were really going to give what they had promised. So we may be reaching an analogous point in the Biden administration where, there were some early successes, there were some big promises, and now the question will be, are they going to press forward and deliver with what they've said they're going to do? And if so, they will have to step on some toes. And I don't know if they're willing or able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a Washington Post opinion piece that said, let's stop dwelling on all the failures. There have been some successes. Maybe they need to get that message. I'd like to turn now to the Supreme Court, which was a thorn in FDR's side during his first administration. And it is, again, I think, to President Biden today, threatening his Democratic agenda. Famously, as you know, FDR was so frustrated with how the Supreme Court was striking down his programs that he tried unsuccessfully to pack the court by expanding the number of justices, introducing mandatory retirement, and so forth. And today we're hearing similar talk of expanding the number of justices. Justice Breyer himself said he might be interested in mandatory retirement if it was across the board. But others are very wary of tinkering with the court. If you were advising President Biden and his administration, what might you draw from the FDR administration's experience?
Well, first I should point out that the Biden administration does have a constituted body on judicial reform, which includes no historians of the New Deal or attempts to reform the judiciary during the 1930s. So I'm going to hazard a guess to say that they're not especially interested in the kinds of things that you or I would have to
learn from it.
Okay, so this will be an exclusive for viewers of this webinar. As in when I get around to writing about the New Deal again, this is going to be one of the things that I'm going to take on as a reassessment of the judicial reform effort of 1937, which I think is poorly treated in the literature and probably needs a kind of overhaul. So just to remind folks, right, the Supreme Court decided against many of the key features of the New Deal in Roosevelt's first term. And Roosevelt and his advisors had anticipated this might happen as early as, again, 1932, 33. And they tried to craft things to get around those kinds of objections. They weren't always successful. And so by the time you got into 1936, 37, they were thinking about increasing the size, not just of the Supreme Court, but of the federal judiciary more generally, right? They wanted to increase the number of judges throughout the federal courts who might be hearing New Deal cases on the argument that these courts were overburdened, that they were hearing too many cases, or in the case of the Supreme Court, turning down cases that they ought to be hearing. So they would have not only increased the size of the Supreme Court, but of the federal judiciary more generally. And the other thing that they considered, which again they didn't go forward with, was to use the Congress's uncontested power to strip from the Supreme Court and the federal court's jurisdiction over certain kinds of legislation. It's important to point out, I feel, in any of these discussions, that whether you're talking about increasing the size of the Supreme Court for political reasons or to strip jurisdiction from the Supreme Court for political reasons, the only party to have successfully done either of those things is the Republican Party, which did them both during Reconstruction. But somehow we talk about this as if this is some sort of, Democratic Party fantasy that was doomed to fail and we should never revisit again, even though we are today living with the legacy still of that effort in the 1870s. So I do think that the standard interpretation of the court packing episode has some merit, which is to say, Roosevelt's threat cost him a lot of political capital, but in the end, the court ruled his way as a result, in part, of his making that threat. That's not a terrible way of thinking about it and might be a useful lesson to think about today. Certainly, there are no such threats emanating from the White House today, although we've seen a notable number of Supreme Court justices insisting that no matter what you may think, no matter what the evidence of your eyes may tell you, the Supreme Court is too an apolitical institution. So it's clear they may be feeling some pressure at the Supreme Court building.
Well, we'll look forward to that book. Now, my time is running down, but I've got two more questions that I'd like to ask. So I will do that. One is that many eyes are now focused on the 2022 midterm elections. You write about the 1938 midterms when the Democrats lost a substantial number of seats in both houses, though it should be said they kept their majorities. That's not what we may be looking at in 2022. And Republicans gained and aligned with conservative Democrats, and it made it very difficult for FDR to succeed with many of the things that he had hoped to. So is there anything to be said about how he handled this defeat and how he maneuvered with a less supportive Congress, which had been so crucial to his earlier successes?
Well, I would say a few things about that. I mean, the first of all is he did double down on many aspects of the New Deal in the wake of that defeat, notably, as we've already discussed, by creating the Civil Rights Unit in the Justice Department. That was at the insistence of Frank Murphy, the liberal Detroit Democrat who Roosevelt made Attorney General and later Supreme Court Justice. And, the argument there was you have to keep delivering, on the New Deal and to show people that democracy with a small d really does matter and that, you have to find ways to do that. And so Roosevelt didn't give up. He didn't give up on the New Deal. And indeed, of course, he continued to press forward with the New Deal through the war. I mean, this is something that I think we sometimes forget about, but one of the reasons, if not the reason, Roosevelt sought the third term was because he saw no liberal democratic alternative, right, for the presidency. He wanted to make sure that the New Deal was preserved and extended through the war. And if he was, of course, successful at that, even if it was, again, a limited success, legislation that came out of the war and the attitudes that came out of the war. Indeed, the war aims, as articulated through the Four Freedoms, were very much New Deal inspired aims and legislation. So Roosevelt did preserve the New Deal even after those electoral defeats. The other thing that I would point out, of course, is, as you know, in the wake of those defeats, he simply sought a different coalition to back the priorities that his administration had. He leaned more on the members of his own party to advocate preparedness legislation because Republicans were largely against it, or the liberal Republicans were largely against it. And, he shifted his political base as he had to in the wake of that electoral setback.
So here's my final sort of question to leave us with. I mean, you make a very convincing case, I think, in the book and in the discussion we're having tonight, that the New Deal saved democracy at a time when it was under serious economic and political threat. And you show us, I think, quite powerfully how much we are still surrounded by the New Deal's achievements. And you've suggested tonight many ways that we can learn from the experience of the New Deal from 1932 to 1945. But I'm wondering, as I was reading the book and preparing for tonight, whether the real inspiration of the New Deal should not so much be in terms of specific policies and programs, but more in terms of the way in which they rather creatively and boldly really took a hard look at the way society was organized, the way the political system was operating. And rather than we look for these sort of fits between then and now, to really take from it that why the New Deal matters is because, they were really willing to be ambitious, to have a new vision, and to not just play by all the old rules. And, I wonder what you think about that, and whether that is a level of a sort of legacy that you would agree with or not.
Well, I think that's true, and there are lots of ways to point that out. I mean, one of the most important that I talk about in the book is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was innovative not just for what it did for the residents of the valley, but for the way it was structured, which is to say it wasn't really a federal agency, it wasn't really a state or local agency, but it was an agency designed to deal with a natural phenomenon, the watershed of the river, and that to make it more sustainable for people to live there. That's very much the kind of thinking that I think we could say we need today, to think about the coastlines, about the riverfronts of the nation, to talk about making these regions more sustainable and to administer them in a way that looks across traditional boundaries. That's very much the kind of legacy that I think we should think about. On the other hand, I would say, Roosevelt liked to liken himself, to a football quarterback, where he would say, I don't know what I'm going to do 2 plays from now. I can only tell you what I'm going to do in this play, and then we'll see how that turns out, right? The thing is, though, like a football quarterback, Roosevelt knew which direction he had to go in. He wasn't going to go in the other direction, right? And this is important to me because people sometimes talk about the experimental and boundary breaking aspect of the New Deal. But Roosevelt did have a fundamental goal in mind, which was to, again, improve American democracy at a time when it was under threat. He didn't want to see it rolled back, right? Because he said during the 1932 campaign, there are some people who think that a dictator could clean up this country, but we don't want dictators in America, right? He was very clear about what he was proposing and what he was pushing against. He didn't want authoritarianism in America. He wanted to preserve, as he said in his inaugural address, essential democracy. So he was certainly creative in finding ways to do that and ways to try to do that, but he always had that essential goal in mind. And I think that's important to remember, even as we laud his pragmatism and his experimentation.
Thank you, Eric. It was great to talk to you about this. And now it's the audience's turn. And I see there have been quite a number of questions. So Susan, I think you come back on now.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. Some of the questions that have come through, you've kind of touched on. I picked up maybe 3 questions if we have the next 10 minutes or so. One of them is about social movements. In particular, I'm thinking about the labor unions and the labor movement and how they empowered and enabled FDR to make the kinds of changes that he did. And I'm wondering if you see such social pressure today and what it is.
Yeah, so as to the first point, I mean, Liz is the historian of this phenomenon much more than I am. But basically, as you know, Roosevelt was pushed by the labor movement, and particularly in his second term by the CIO, by that wing of the labor movement, to do much more than he had been doing. And that's true also earlier in his term of, for example, agricultural organizations who were pressing him to do things. And he was, as you said, through Eleanor, sometimes responsive to civil rights organizations, especially in the early years of mobilization for the war. So he was frequently pressed from social movements. I think the key there to remember is that the Roosevelt administration, not just Franklin Roosevelt personally, but the Roosevelt administration in its various offices, was very open to being pushed from the left. Indeed, sometimes it encouraged social movements on the left specifically to give them room to maneuver, so that the president could then say, well, those people over there, obviously you don't want that. That's outside the realm of what's possible, but I will offer you something 2 degrees to the right of that, and it would be a substantial change nevertheless, right? Roosevelt was very good at that particular maneuver, right? Famously, I think apocryphally, but famously, he told someone, and different accounts say different people, you've told me what the right thing to do is. I'm persuaded it's the right thing to do. Now make me do it, right? That Roosevelt sort of understood how to use social pressure to open up space for Congress and for his administration to move.
I'll just
let
add
Liz take-
I'll just add a few points that I've been thinking about too. I mean, I think there definitely are social movements that were important then and are important today. Today, I think they're different ones, though. They're environmentalists, they're Black Lives Matter. That one of the big puzzles and maybe disappointments is that, as you said, the labor movement and working class Americans were really crucial to Roosevelt's constituency, and they helped to give him those enormous victories. Today, we see a very different picture. Unions are, of course, not building, they're in decline, but it's a bigger puzzle and challenge that many lower income Americans are really not aligning themselves with a Democratic president, but rather with Trump and Trump's Republican Party. And this is a huge loss, and I think, to the Democratic Party. Biden is a president who you made mention of this earlier, who speaks in New Deal language. He still talks about big labor and unions, but it's a very different reality. And I do think that remains, a real challenge for the Democratic Party, is how to welcome back in working people. And I don't know whether you have any insights into what's different now. Many things are different now, of course. But that, the Democratic Party looks very different today than it did in the 1930s. That's something to keep in mind. I mean, we know there are poor people, there are still Black Americans, there are upper middle class and middle class professionals, but the Democratic Party has lost many of the working Americans who had supported it during this period.
For the sake of time, I have a couple questions that I'm going to try to combine into one question, and perhaps it's something that you both would like to respond to. In your book, Eric, you say that there was a belief in a common purpose during the New Deal. It gave Americans permission to believe in a common purpose that was not war. And I'm wondering if you see such a common purpose today. And the second part of the question is, can we even replicate something like the New Deal today, given how polarized our politics are today?
Well, I think you can, and I think that it would entail doing something similar to what the original New Deal did. I again, folks often think about the New Deal, particularly members of the Living New Deal project, often think about the legacy of the New Deal in terms of its cultural output, right? Its paintings, its murals, its extents, its more ephemeral things like its theater projects and its writings. I think we need to remember that the New Deal, again, in that way, sending artists, writers, sociologists, anthropologists to all corners of the country to give dignity to what everyone was doing, right, is part of the way it helped to create that sense of common purpose. I mean, you have only to look at the New Deal WPA volume on my home state of Florida to get a sense of this, where there are people who are self-identified as crackers, where there are the descendants of Bahamian immigrants, where there are Black Americans who are the descendants of people who've been held in slavery, who are all part of the state of Florida, where there is agriculture, where there is ranching, where there is not even yet the tourism that would become to be important, right? And yet it somehow hangs together as a unified whole, unified concretely by the parks and highways that the New Deal helped to build, and described so eloquently by Zora Neale Thurston and by the Zora Neale Thurston and the and her staff that worked for the WPA to write that book, to see how important the cultural component of the project has to be. You have to be extremely articulate and to give a platform to a multitude of voices to give people that sense of widespread inclusion. So if we decide to do that, yes, I think we can.
I guess I'm not quite as optimistic, but I think you're right that it was very much a part of a deliberate strategy. The person who headed the big photography project said that one of their goals was to introduce Americans to each other. There is still a tremendous need for that. I do think, though, that, we're in an environment today of social media, of many competing platforms and access to information. It is harder I think, to build that sort of common cause. But I think it has to happen because we're at a point now where even things that you think are good for everybody, like infrastructure, like roads and bridges and mass transit and sewers and all the things that people struggle with on a daily basis, that becomes so polarized and so politicized that the most obvious things really do bring on objections because of politics. So we do have to come up with some strategies that work, I think, for the 21st century to bring people together. And I'm not sure what they are, but it is really a goal, I think, that we should aspire to.
Yeah, I'm not saying it would be easy to kind of recreate, the Federal Writers Project or something like that, but to borrow from President Kennedy, who, as I point out in the book, was in many ways inspired by the New Deal, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, that's a wonderful place to, I think, close. I wish we had more time. I have many questions, and there's many questions in the Q&A that you might want to look at and respond to if you can. But it's been a really, really helpful, instructive, exciting, juicy conversation. And I'm very grateful to have you on this webinar with us. And I'm also very grateful for the audience who came. We had almost 90 people, I think. And I hope to see you all again soon. And our next webinar is the 21st of October with Neil Maher on the CCC. And I want to say thank you again to our guests. So good night for now.
Good night. Thank you, Eric, for the book and for tonight.
Thanks very much. Good night.